There's no doubt that the resurrection of Jesus stands as the linchpin for the entire Christian faith. If no one had ever come to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead, there probably never would have been such a thing as Christianity. During his lifetime, Jesus himself was a Jew, and his followers were Jews. Jesus preached a Jewish message based on his understanding of the Jewish scripture and of the Jewish God. He proclaimed that in his own generation, God would intervene in history to destroy the forces of evil and establish his long-awaited kingdom on earth. If Jesus had been arrested and crucified for crimes against the state, and no one ever came to think God had raised him from the dead, he would have ended up being a footnote in Jewish history, at best. Another ill-advised prophet who made predictions that never came true and paid the price of it with his life. If his followers continued together as a group, they would merely have been a small sect within Judaism that itself would have died out in time. It was the belief in the resurrection that changed everything. Once the disciples of Jesus came to think that God had raised him from the dead, they came to re-understand everything that he had ever said and ever done in a new light. It's important to remember that in the ancient world, someone who was exalted to heaven, who was seated on a throne next to God, was himself seen as divine. We've seen that in pagan circles with figures like Romulus and Apollonius of Tyana, and we've seen it in Jewish circles with people like Enoch and the Son of Man. Someone who is exalted to heaven becomes a divine being. And that's what the disciples immediately came to see Jesus as, a divinity, not merely a human. Jesus himself, during his lifetime, had taught that the Son of Man was soon to come from heaven over the earth. His disciples, who came to believe that he had been raised from the dead, thought that he had been exalted to heaven, and they started saying that he was that Son of Man. He was the one who was coming in judgment over the earth. He was soon to return in order to bring the end of all things. Jesus was the Son of Man. Jesus himself, during his earthly ministry, had taught that he would be the king of that future kingdom, the Messiah. He told his disciples that the 12 of them would be seated on 12 thrones, ruling the 12 tribes of Israel. And he must have taught them that he would be their leader then, as he was their leader now. In other words, he would be the king of the future kingdom. But after his death, his disciples came to believe he had been raised from the dead and exalted to heaven, and they started saying that he was in fact the king, not the king just of the future, but the king of the present. Jesus was already the king, and not just of Israel, but of the whole world. And so they started calling him the Lord of heaven and earth. Jesus had presented himself as a prophet who knew God's will. His disciples started saying that he was far more than that. At his resurrection and exaltation, he had been seated on a throne next to God, and he had been made a divine being. This was the beginning of the proclamation that Jesus was God. It all hinges on the belief in Jesus' resurrection. Given the fundamental importance of the resurrection for the beginning of Christianity as a religion separate from Judaism, and for understanding Jesus himself as a divine figure, it's necessary for us to ask, what can we know about it historically? What can historians say about what happened to make the disciples come to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead? And what can historians not say about this key event that ended up changing the history of our entire world? It's important to stress that I'm asking what the historian can say as a historian. There are, of course, historians who are Christian believers, and there are other historians who are not. If the resurrection could be established as having happened historically, following the historical disciplines rigorously, or as not having happened, why would one group of historians accept it as having happened and another group not? Is it that one group of historians, either the Christians or the non-Christians, just happen to be better historians than the others? Is it that the non-Christians are hard-hearted and refuse to see the facts even when they're put before their very eyes? Or that Christian historians are gullible and more easily swayed? Or are there other reasons why most Christian historians believe in the resurrection and non-Christian historians do not? In this lecture, I'll be arguing that there are in fact other reasons, and that they are unrelated to the facts of history. That in fact the belief in the resurrection is not based on historical knowledge. To explain what these reasons are, I need to talk a little bit about historical method and about what it is that historians can and cannot demonstrate about the past. The first point to make is one that most people have never thought of and that at first may sound a bit confusing, but it's absolutely of central importance. History is not the past. Let me stress the point: history is not the past. When we talk about the past, we mean everything that has ever happened before now. When we talk about history, we mean everything that we can show has happened before now. These are obviously not the same thing. That's because most of the past cannot be shown to have happened with anything like proof. Sometimes that's because we lack adequate sources for the past. There's no way in the world that anyone can show historically what it is my grandfather ate for lunch on March 3rd, 1951. It's in the past, it almost certainly happened, but we have no access to it. There are other things we cannot show historically simply because they're not the kinds of things that history can show. History cannot show that the square root of 144 is 12. That's a mathematical question. And if you know that in fact it's true, it's not because you've done a historical investigation, but because you've done the math. History cannot show that I loved my grandmother. It would be possible to show, in theory, how I behaved toward my grandmother. For example, you could ask my other family members. And even theoretically, history can show how I behaved toward her in ways that seem to suggest that I loved her. But history has no access to my internal emotional states, only to historical events. You may know that 5 years ago you loved your spouse, but your knowledge is not based on historical facts, but on emotional sensibilities. And so the past is everything that happened before. What my grandfather ate at one time, the fact that you answered a mathematical question correctly on an exam, my feelings toward my grandmother or yours toward your spouse. And history is what can be shown to have happened in the past. These are not the same thing. One thing that history cannot show that happened in the past are miracles, including the miracle of the resurrection. This is not because historians have to be secular humanists with anti-supernaturalist biases, as some Christian apologists sometimes claim. In fact, there are Christian historians just as there are non-Christian historians, and none of them can demonstrate on historical grounds that the resurrection happened, even if it did. There are two reasons why historians cannot demonstrate that miracles ever happened, even if they did happen. The first has to do with the presuppositions that historians bring to their work when they are working as historians. All of us have presuppositions. It's not that some historians have them and that they are therefore subjective, and that other historians work without them, and that they are, as a consequence, objective. Everyone has presuppositions. The question is, what kinds of presupposition are appropriate for the task at hand? When it comes to reconstructing the past, which is the work of the historian, some presuppositions are acceptable and others are not. Historians presuppose, for example, that the past did happen. Now, there's no way to prove that it happened. We just assume, like virtually everyone else, that it really did. It's a presupposition that historians have. They also presuppose that there are ways of showing what is likely to have happened in the past. Some things are more likely than others. It is virtually certain that my University of North Carolina Tar Heels won the National Basketball Championship in 2009. And it's virtually certain they did not win the same championship in 2010. These and a billion other things from the past are virtually certain. But other things are not. It's much more difficult, for example, to demonstrate that there was a lone gunman in the assassination of JFK. So, some things are more readily shown to have happened in the past than others, and historians presuppose that we're working with levels of probability. Historians also presuppose that the way one demonstrates what happened in the past is by appealing to historical sources and criteria, rather than, for example, mathematical proofs, which are used by mathematicians for what they want to demonstrate, or by psychological testing, which is used by psychologists for what they want to demonstrate. Historians have to go to historical sources using historical criteria, much as I've described them in my previous lecture. These then are among the appropriate presuppositions for doing history. There are other presuppositions that are not appropriate for historians, for the simple reason that they're not shared by other historians engaged in the investigation. For example, historians cannot conclude that the reason the Allies won World War II was because Martians came down and dictated the course of the war, leading to the destruction of the Axis powers. Now, maybe that is what happened in the past, but historians cannot claim it is what happened because it requires certain presuppositions not widely held among historians. For example, that there are Martians and that they intervene in our worldly affairs. So too, historians, when they are engaged in doing history, cannot conclude that the Mormon religion started when the angel Moroni appeared to Joseph Smith, revealing to him the golden tablets. Maybe that did happen, but claiming that it did requires the historian to believe that there is such a thing as angels, that Moroni is one of them, that Joseph Smith had a revelation from a divine being, and so on. These are theological beliefs. They may be true, but they're theological beliefs, and they're beliefs that not everyone shares. For example, Jews, Buddhists, Muslims, and atheists. And since they're not widely shared among historians engaged in the task of history, they cannot be among the presuppositions of the historian. Alleged historians who want to speak about Martians or the angel Moroni simply won't get a wide hearing for their view. History has to be done on the basis of widely held assumptions about the world. Otherwise, it's not history, but theology, or ufology, or something else. The same applies to belief in the resurrection of Jesus. Even if it is a past event, it cannot be established historically because it presupposes matters of belief that are not shared by all investigators. For example, that there is a God, that Jesus is his son, that God interacts in history, and that God performs miraculous events. The other problem with trying to prove on historical grounds that a miracle such as the resurrection of Jesus happened is that one of the presuppositions appropriate to historical inquiry is that we can only establish what probably happened in the past. We cannot prove the past the way we can prove a scientific experiment. A scientist sets up an experiment, performs the experiment, controls the variables, repeats the experiment, and if the experiment is repeated the same way with the same variables every time, the scientist will come up with the same result. If that happens time after time after time, then there's an expectation that if the same experiment is performed again, then we know what will happen the next time. Experiments can be repeated, but the past cannot be repeated. Once the past happens, it's over and done with. That means historians have to have other kinds of evidence for establishing their probabilities. Historians establish levels of probability for the past based on whatever surviving evidence there happens to be. Some things are so highly probable that we may as well call them certain. The Allies did win World War II. JFK was assassinated. Other events are very probable indeed. Caesar probably did cross the Rubicon. Others are fairly probable. My grandfather likely ate something on March 3, 1951. Other events are at least possible. Maybe there was a king in England after the Romans left, a king who became the basis for the stories of King Arthur. Other events are unlikely, highly unlikely, or almost certainly unhistorical. For example, that Elvis was seen alive again last Thursday in Memphis, or that Charlemagne became a Buddhist. Pick any example out of millions. The problem with miracles is that they are, by definition, if not impossible, then possible only in the most infinitesimally most remote degree. Otherwise, they wouldn't be miraculous. How often do people walk on the water at your local lake? Or levitate above the clouds? Or successfully order a thunderstorm to stop? Or feed 5,000 people to the full with 5 loaves of bread? Or raise someone who has been long dead? If you think such things are possible, that's fine. Many people do think they are possible. But the fact is that even if you think so, you would admit that they happen so rarely that you have to call them miraculous. And so the problem. Historians can only establish what probably happened in the past, and if miracles are by definition the least probable occurrence, then historians cannot show that they happened. This does not mean that historians have to be non-believers. It means if they believe in miracles, it's on the basis of faith, not on the basis of historical knowledge. In short, even if Jesus was raised from the dead in the past, there's no way for historians to show it historically. People who think he was raised think so not because of historical evidence, but because that's their belief. Even though we cannot establish historically that God raised Jesus from the dead, there are some things that we can say about the traditions of Jesus' resurrection historically. Some of these things are historically unlikely, and others are probable. One thing that's virtually certain, as we'll see in the next lecture, is that whether or not Jesus was actually raised from the dead, some of his followers believed he was. That's a historical reality. There are other things, however, that are not so certain. First, I've already shown why it's unlikely, at least, that Jesus was buried in a known tomb. Second, this means that it is also unlikely that the tomb was discovered to be empty by his followers. If there was no tomb to go to, then it wasn't found abandoned. It's important to remember that the first record we have of there being an empty tomb was the Gospel of Mark, which was written around the year 65 or 70 CE, some 40 years after the fact, based on stories that Mark had heard that had been in circulation by word of mouth during the intervening 4 decades. The empty tomb is never mentioned by the Apostle Paul, writing some 20 years earlier. Remember this passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 5. Paul is writing to the Corinthians to remind them what it is that they were taught when he first was among them, converting them to believe in Jesus. As he said, I handed unto you what was of first importance, what I received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Paul goes on to list the appearances of Jesus to the disciples. He does not mention the empty tomb, either in this passage or somewhere else. Historians have long asked, if Paul knew about the empty tomb and he wanted to demonstrate that Jesus was raised from the dead, why didn't he mention the empty tomb? Well, there's no evidence that Paul knew about the empty tomb. What this means is we have no eyewitness to the empty tomb, far from it. We have stories that were in circulation year after year after year that some Christians probably had never even heard of. Third, we don't know when the disciples first said that Jesus was raised from the dead. The tradition in the Gospels indicates that it was 3 days later, but it's very hard to know if that's right. In other words, it's hard to know that the tradition that Jesus was raised on the third day, if that tradition started on the third day, or if in fact it was a tradition that was developed later. If the Gospels are right, that the disciples fled from Jesus when he was arrested, it's likely that they would have escaped from the city to return home. The disciples were afraid that they themselves would get in trouble with the law, that they themselves would be arrested, that they themselves would be put on trial and possibly executed for supporting an insurrection. And so they went into hiding. And according to some of our Gospels, what they did is they went home. And where was home? Jerusalem was the capital of Judea, in the southern part of what we now think of as Israel. The disciples, like Jesus himself, were from Galilee. According to the Gospels, the disciples were told that they were supposed to meet Jesus in Galilee. They're told this by the women who came to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Our first account, once more, is in the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, we're told that 3 women went to the tomb after Jesus had died: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. There at the tomb, they find that there's no one in the tomb. This is the first account of the empty tomb. But there's a young man there who says that they're not to be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He's been raised. He's not here. Go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. And so they are supposed to go to Galilee to see Jesus. According to our later gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, that's precisely what happened. In this account, women go to the tomb on the third day as they do in the Gospel of Mark. In this instance, it happens to be a different set of women. It's only Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. At the tomb, they find that it's empty. And then suddenly, in this account, Jesus meets them. And he says to them, greetings. And he says to them, not the young man at the tomb, but Jesus says to them in this account, don't be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. And then we're told the 11 disciples, since Judas has now killed himself, the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus directed them, and when they saw him, they worshiped him. They went to Galilee after Jesus' death. Historically, what probably happened? Well, the disciples are afraid of being arrested, and so they go home. They go to Galilee. Galilee is in the northern part of Israel. Capernaum, the base of Jesus' operation, was about 120 miles from Jerusalem. That's at least a week's walk. My question is, when did the disciples first start saying that Jesus was raised from the dead? We shouldn't think that necessarily it was on the third day. It may have been at least a week later, and maybe it was much longer after that. Remember, our earliest accounts of this are written decades later. The belief in Jesus' resurrection may not have happened right away. Fourth, it's impossible to know who was the first to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead. As we saw in this passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul indicates that Christ first appeared to Cephas, that is, to Peter. But in the Gospels, Jesus appears first to Mary Magdalene and the other women. Well, which is it? Was it Peter or was it Mary Magdalene? There are Christian apologists who attempt to defend the Christian faith with logical argumentation, who have argued that these appearances in the Gospels to Mary Magdalene and the other women are hard to explain unless, in fact, they're historical. This is an argument that the women really did see Jesus and found the empty tomb and then told it to others. The logic behind this apologetic argument is that in the ancient world, women could not be accepted as reliable witnesses in courts of law. If somebody wanted to make up the idea of Jesus' tomb being discovered, they wouldn't make up the idea that it was women who discovered the tomb, according to this apologetic logic. I understand the logic of this argument, and it's a view that I used to hold myself for many, many years. I thought there's no way that this story could be made up because it's women who discovered the tomb. I've since come to think otherwise. The question is, who in early Christianity would make up the idea that women had gone to the tomb if somebody made up that idea? In fact, you can think up a lot of explanations for why it is women are the ones said to find the empty tomb. First, who would be likely to make up the story that women found the empty tomb? Well, maybe women would make up the story that women found the empty tomb. We know that women were well represented in early Christianity. In fact, a lot of our sources suggest that there were more women in the faith than there were men in the faith. These women played prominent roles in the earliest years of Christianity. It's possible that women would have come up with such a story. Second, it makes sense that women were the ones who would discover the empty tomb for the simple reason that these people going to the tomb, say they're men, say they're women. Who's going to the tomb? People who want to prepare the body for burial. And who is it in the ancient world that prepares bodies for burial? It's women. And so naturally, it's the women who would go to the tomb, and if they're the ones who go to the tomb, they're the ones who would find it empty. Moreover, as we've already seen, the accounts claim that the men disciples have fled the scene. In other words, they've probably gone back to Galilee. If they've fled the scene, who is there left to go to the empty tomb? It would be the women. According to our Gospels, when Jesus went to Jerusalem, he went in the company of his 12 disciples, but also with a group of women. The men disciples have fled, so who is left behind? It's the women, and so naturally they would find the empty tomb. But there's even a more convincing reason to think that somebody could have made up the story of women going to the tomb, that it's not at all implausible. Our first account of this, of course, is the Gospel of Mark, which indicates that there were three women, Mary Magdalene, another Mary, and Salome. The three of them go to the tomb. They're the ones who learn at the tomb by a young man that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and that they're to go tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee. Mark is very interesting because it ends in the very next verse. It says, the women fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. Period. The Gospel of Mark ends there, with the women not telling anyone. This is a terrific ending to the Gospel of Mark, and it's unlike any of the other Gospels. In the other Gospels, the women do go tell, the disciples do come to believe. Jesus appears to the disciples. But in Mark, Jesus never appears to anybody. This makes perfect sense for Mark's Gospel in particular. Mark's Gospel is all about how people don't understand who Jesus is. This is repeatedly emphasized throughout the Gospel. Jesus' family thinks that he's crazy, and they try to take him out of the public view in chapter 2. The townspeople of Jesus don't understand how he can have such wisdom. The Jewish leaders think that he's possessed by the devil, Beelzebub. And the disciples themselves don't understand who Jesus is, as is repeatedly stated in the gospel. Jesus on several occasions complains with some perplexity, "Don't you yet understand?" Finally, halfway through the gospel, Peter says to Jesus, when he's asked, who am I? Peter replies, "You are the Messiah." But he doesn't even understand what that means. Jesus has to explain that as the Messiah, he needs to suffer and die. Well, Peter, who has the Jewish expectation of a Messiah, doesn't think Jesus is going to go suffer and die. He doesn't understand. And they never come to understand. Mark's gospel ends with the disciples never coming to understand that Jesus has been raised from the dead. This fits in perfectly with the themes of Mark's gospel otherwise. It would not be at all implausible that Mark is the one who invented the idea that the women came to the tomb, found it empty, and didn't tell anybody, because the disciples then never come to a recognition that Jesus had to die and be raised from the dead, a Markan theme. Now, I don't personally think that Mark is the one who invented this idea of the women going to the tomb. But if Mark could have a literary reason in order to come up with this story, then someone before him also could have come up with the story, which means that this apologetic idea that no one would invent a story of women going to the tomb is absolutely wrong. Fifth, it's impossible to know how many of the disciples of Jesus came to believe he had been raised from the dead. According to the Gospels, of course, it was all of the 11, along with Jesus' women followers from Galilee. But it's striking that in every instance in which Jesus appears to his disciples in the Gospels, some or all of them doubt, as we will see in the next lecture. This may be most easily explained on the grounds that some of Jesus' followers never did come to believe it. In short, historians cannot establish that God raised Jesus from the dead, even though theologians, with their different sets of presuppositions, may well argue that he was raised. And believers certainly believe he was. But this is not a historical claim, even if it did happen in the past. It's a theological or religious claim. In addition, there are numerous aspects of the stories of Jesus' resurrection that are highly doubtful. But there are also some things that are certain, and that is what we'll be discussing in the next lecture.